So I'm going to continue my series on Specters of Marx by Jacques Derrida, my second favorite 70s post-structuralist philosopher after Foucault, who focused on the deconstruction of language. And this is obviously his book partially about Marx, in which he's often analyzing quotes of other philosophers' opinions on Marx, and sometimes he's agreeing, sometimes he's disagreeing. This is what post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida were actually like, as opposed to the stupid bullshit claims that dumbass pseudo-intellectual crackpots like Jordan Peterson make about them being Marxists. Anyway, so also for the context of this paragraph, I should Alfred North Whitehead. He was a 19th and 20th century philosopher and mathematician. He kind of actually developed some like philosophical and mathematical theories along with like that are more specifically mathematical, I should say. But he also came up with this idea of immanence as opposed to Plato's idea of transcendence. Transcendence, they, of course, famous ancient Greek philosopher Plato, he had the idea of transcendence, that there's a transcendent realm of forms, and there can be a perfect form of something, and something can reach that, but it's something like above human perception, is the something perfection that represents perfection in the realm of forms. So he would say that God is based on transcendent based on that. But you can say like there's the ultimate example of a chair, the perfect example of a chair. Perfect doesn't make it divine, but there's the ultimate perfect example of a chair. And like to Plato, God would be an example of something perfection in the transcendent realm of forms, perhaps. So anyway, it's immanence as a in opposition to transcendence is more that like we're all part of the same thing. So if we're talking about Whitehead got into this idea of an immanent God that I've talked about before, as opposed to a transcendent God in the style of Plato. We could say if we're talking, we can say in opposition to transcendence that an immanent God is something that is changed as much by humans as we as it changes us. So we change God as much as God changes us, and God can even change its mind based on interactions with us. God is not all powerful, all knowing, judgmental, all that kind of stuff. The traditional ideas, which I find a lot more interesting, and there are people who believe in versions of gods like that, which I find more fascinating too. And we can even get into like ideas of Nietzsche's Death of God opening up the door for a religion without a metaphysical God, that one of my favorite atheist pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty writes about in his book with that Catholic philosopher Gianni Vittima that I've been talking about. But anyway, so Derrida starts this is Derrida starting out the paragraph here. Immanence and desire of resurrection. Renaissance or revenants. At night, he's of course being very obscure here, as always. Well, not as always, but as usual. At nightfall, one does not know if imminence means that the expected one has already returned. And within the context of this paragraph, the expected one, it sounds like he's personifying it, but it's basically he's actually talking about time, it seems, when he's talking about the expected one. It sounds like weird and spiritual, but he's talking about time. He just writes in deliberately provocative and confusing ways that we talked about before in a few videos about Derrida. So anyway, the expected one has already returned. One does not know if imminence means that the expected one has already returned. Had he not already announced himself? Had time not already announced itself? To announce oneself, moreover, is that not already to be there in some way? So if the expected one has already announced themselves, then they were already expected in some way. Well, that doesn't necessarily they have to be announced, but he's basically using this as a metaphor and saying that if we if we know that if we know that time is that's something ahead of, yeah, like we can say if we know that the future is to be expected, then why does it need to announce itself because we know that it's coming? I mean, he could perhaps, knowing Derrida, actually be doing this just to be provocative and get us to ask the question, if we're expecting the future, does that actually mean it's going to happen? Because if you're talking about the the expected one announcing itself, but it doesn't actually have to be announced if it's expected, then you could say that maybe, the future the future is different, not just different from what we expect, but the future isn't even necessarily the future. Is the future if we like expect it to happen? That's his like strange his perspective on it, basically, which is interesting, I'd say. Okay, so to announce oneself, moreover, is that not already to be there in some way? One does not know if the expectation prepares the coming of the future to come, or if it recalls the repetition of the same thing as ghost. That's it. That's where it gets interesting. So one does not know if the expectation prepares the coming of the future to come. So does our expectation cause the future to come, or does our expectation of the future recall the repetition of the same? I don't think he's necessarily meaning by the repetition of the same, Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, sort of similar to reincarnation, but except we relive the same lives over and over again in exactly the same way. So I don't think he necessarily means that, though. So if if the expectation of the future does the expectation of the future cause the future, or is the future a recollection of the repetition of the events of the past? Like, are we in the future, are we just remembering the past, or is our expectation of the future causing it to happen? Like, clearly it seems obvious that we're clearly not causing the future to happen by our expectations of it. But I mean, in a way, we think about what is going to happen in the future, and then we base our current actions on what we want to accomplish in the future. Not all the time, anyway. You should be in the moment and think about the past to learn from your mistakes and all that stuff, of course. But that makes sense because that's the way people think about accomplishing goals, right? So the repetition of the same thing as a ghost. So basically, the future. What if the future is a ghost of the past? Because it's like the future is a memory of the past. And in terms of a ghost, see, like the book is called Specters of Marx, right? So in terms of ghosts and in terms of time, we can talk about from the perspective of Derrida, he's probably talking about this idea of time. And he has a what I think is a Shakespeare quote here that he puts in brackets too. What has this thing appeared again tonight? I think that's a quote from I don't remember which Shakespeare play, but a Shakespeare play in which there's a ghost. Maybe it's Hamlet in which he sees his father's ghost. I'm not sure, but anyway, like it seems to me like I was about to call him Derrida is saying in this paragraph that that time is a specter. So basically, if we're talking about the past, the present, and the future, then the future is a ghost or a specter of the past. And in this context, he's talking about it in terms of culture. So, like, in terms of the book in general, it's similar to what the so-called critical theorists like Adorno and Horkheimer and many and others who have talked about Habermas, obviously, for for sure have talked about basically cultural remnants of Marxism such as aesthetics, that have remained in modern Western culture even after the downfall of communist dystopias. So basically, similarly to that, if we're talking about ideas, the future is the ghost of the past because the ideas of the past are carried through the present and forward to the future. So that is all why exactly to Derrida, time is basically time is a ghost of an idea. Time is just an idea, and the future is the ghost of the past.